Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to a new member of our Patreon family, Alan. Alan, thank you so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming a member of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. And in this month of December, you and everyone else who supports us via Patreon or through a one-time tip via buymeacoffee.com, no subscription required, will be entered into a raffle for an extra special prize, a 3-month subscription to Libro.fm, a wonderful source of audiobooks that supports independent bookstores while giving you an alternative to Amazon. This membership will entitle you to 3 free audiobooks of your choice, with the profits split with the independent bookstore of your choice, which is a pretty marvelous thing. I'll be drawing the winner on Christmas Eve, December 24th, so you have until then to get your name in the stocking. You'll find links to both Patreon and buymeacoffee.com in the show description, and I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're returning to one of the most popular books ever read on this podcast, The History of Bread, From Prehistoric to Modern Times, by John Ashton. First published in 1904 by the Religious Tract Society of London. Let's pick up right where we left off. Chapter 6. Bread in Europe and America. Olaus Magnus, Archbishop of Uppsala, who lived in the first half of the 16th century, has left behind him in his Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus a long and lucid account of Scandinavian life and manners. Respecting harvest, he tells us that in the northern countries, in many fields of the Visigoths, on that part that lies southward, barley is ripe and mown in 36 days from the date of sowing. That is, from the end of June to the middle of August, and sometimes sooner. And other corn sown in the beginning of May is reaped in the middle of August, by the mutual help of the countrymen, not with any great pains, but with alacrity and willing minds, lest cold winds should blow upon it and blast the corn. And they desire no other reward for their daily labor than a merry feast at night, where the young people of both sexes, by reason of their faithful labors in the field, by the judgment, consent, and permission of their provident parents, are made choice of for to be married. He tells us that the farther north you go, the less wheat is grown, but there is more towards the south, the Swedes having plenty of wheat but more rye. But the Goths, both east and west, who feed on barley and oats, have an infinite abundance given them by the mercy of God. Yet there is use made of all these sorts of corn in both places. But the Swedes provide most of rye, where their women know so well how to winnow rye, that for color, taste, and for health, it surpasses the goodness of wheat. In order to preserve their corn, they carefully dried it. On the hottest days, when the sun shines strong, they spread cloths like ships' sails, or else the sails themselves upon the ground, or on the tops of mountains where there is no grass, and they lay the corn out to dry for 6 or more or fewer days, as the sun shines hot. Then, when it is cleaned, they lay it up in vessels of oak, or else they grind it, and so lay it up safe, and when it is so dried, it will last good for years. But if it be not ground meal but corn, it is convenient once a year to set it in the sun to be again dried, and thus new dried corn may be mingled with it prudently. But the meal thrust into the oaken vessels or tuns by strong ramming it in with wooden mallets and laid up in a dry place will last many years and never be worm-eaten. He also discourses on the variety of mills for grinding corn in use. How there was the windmill that turned by running water, by horsepower, by hands and feet, backwards and forwards, like the prehistoric mealing stones, and also the quern, but he mostly extols the windmills of Holland. The grain being ground, it was ready for making into bread, and he minutely describes the operation, how it was kneaded into a round shape, then rolled very thin, and finally baked on a sheet of iron like a warrior's shield, supported by a tripod, and heated by a slow fire. In fact, the griddle or girdle cakes of North Britain. But there was other bread which was baked in an oven, and here the artist seems to have drawn somewhat upon his imagination for his cockroaches and black beetles. It seems that bread was not sold by weight, and that they were in the habit about Christmas time of making what we should call dough babies, about the size of a 5-year-old child, of which they made presents, and similar but smaller babies of wheat flour, which they sold. They also made a gingerbread of flour, honey, and spices, which travelers in the winter made use of. Another bread of flour, milk, butter, eggs, and ginger. Then also they baked biscuits for shipboard and for victualling forts. But he pathetically points out that these biscuits, if kept for a length of time, especially in a damp place, developed dangerous energy in the shape of weevils, which were harmless. He says of the griddle cakes that they would keep good for 20 or more years, by which time they would be reasonably stale. Scarcely 2 centuries have passed since rye flour by itself, or mixed with wheat, furnished nearly all the bread consumed by the laboring classes of England. With the exception of wheat, rye contains a greater proportion of gluten than any other cereal, to which fact it owes its capability of being converted into a spongy bread. And if anyone wishes to try it for themselves, here is a recipe for making Grislick's Suurbrood, or hushhoudingsbrod, bread for the household, which is the ordinary bread for the eastern parts of Norway. Contrary to our expectations, we found white bread everywhere, but the common bread is a heavy bread, the chief ingredient of which is rye. It is always sour. The good wife intends it to be so. They also have flat bread, flatbrød, made of potatoes and rye. It was this kind of bread that the 2 women whom we happened in upon were making. They were in a little underground room, unlighted except from the door. The women making the bread were seated on either side of a long, low table, upon which were huge mounds of dough. The one nearest the door cut off a piece of this, and molded it, and rolled it out to a certain degree of thinness. Then the other one took it, and with the greatest care rolled it still more. At her right hand was the fireplace, and upon the coal was a red piece of iron, forming a huge griddle more than half a yard across. The bread matched this very nearly in size when it was ready to be baked, and it was spread out and turned upon the griddle with great dexterity. And as soon as it was baked, it was added to a great heap on the floor. The woman said she should continue to bake bread for 30 days. She had a large family of men who consumed a great deal, and they had to bake very often in consequence. In many places they do not bake bread oftener than twice a year. Then it is a circumstance like haying or harvesting. We heard an Englishman say of this bread of the country, one might eat an acre of it and then not be satisfied. In Denmark, too, rye bread is the rule among the peasantry and small farmers, wheaten bread being to them a luxury and used as cake is with us. In Russia, although its chief export is wheat from the Black Sea and oats and rye from the Baltic, the peasant eats but rye bread dipped in hemp oil. And even then, as but a few years since, famine visits this granary, and the hapless peasants being reduced to mix auroch and bark with their wretched bread, have at times been unable to procure even this, and have died in thousands of starvation. Although Austria-Hungary produces wheat, which makes the finest bread flour in the world, yet throughout the Austrian Empire the peasantry eat rye bread, whilst at Vienna the wheaten bread, especially the Kaiser Semmel, which is what we should term a dinner roll or manchet, is simply perfection. The excellence of the Viennese bread is said to be owing to the bakers, the ovens, and the yeast. The men work according to the traditions of the past, which have been handed down to them. The ovens are heated by wood fires lit inside them during 4 hours. The ashes are then raked out, and the oven is carefully wiped with wisps of damp straw. On the vapor thus generated, as well as that produced by the baking of the dough, lies the whole art of the browning and the success of the semmel. An ounce of yeast, or 3 decagrams, and as much salt is taken for every gallon of milk used for the dough. The yeast is a Viennese specialty, known as St. Marxner Presshefe, and its composition is a secret. It keeps 2 days in summer and a little longer in winter. Viennese bread is noted for the fantastic shapes into which it is made, but concerning the crescent shape, the following legend is told. Many years ago, when there was war between the Austrians and the Turks, the city of Vienna was besieged, and so closely invested that famine seemed inevitable unless the inhabitants yielded and surrendered to the hated Turks. One day, a baker in his cellar noted a peculiar noise, and looking about, discovered that a boy's drum on the ground in a corner had some marbles on the parchment, which every little while danced about and caused the odd sound. Surprised, he listened intently, and found that the noise was repeated at regular intervals. He put his ear to the ground and could distinguish a thumping sound, which on reflection he concluded must be produced by the enemy undermining the city. He went to the authorities with his story, but at first it was discredited. At last the general in command made an investigation and found the baker's suspicions correct. A countermine was made and exploded, and the Turks repulsed. On the restoration of peace, the Emperor of Austria sent for the baker, and expressing his gratitude to him for having saved the city, asked what reward he could claim. The modest baker refused riches or rank, but only asked the privilege of making his bread hereafter in the form of the crescent, which had so long been their terror, so that it might be a reminder to those who ate it that the God of the Christian is greater than the God of the infidel. So the imperial order was issued granting the baker and his descendants the sole right to make their bread in the shape of the Turkish crescent. As in Austria, so in Germany, good wheaten bread can be got in towns and cities, though not so fine as in Austria, by reason of the flour, and the peasantry are content to have rye and barley bread. Pumpernickel, to wit, is one of the oldest varieties of bread, and the first to come into general use. It is made of barley, and must be baked in an oven especially made for the purpose. This kind of bread is considered very nutritious, and is of a sweet taste. In many parts of Germany there are large bakeries where pumpernickel is baked as a specialty, whence it is sent into the smaller towns and even exported to other countries in loaves of 4 pounds, 8 pounds, and 12 pounds weight. At Soest, Una, and Brostad, large quantities are made for exportation, for the expatriated German carries his love of fatherland with him, and at Berlin there is also a bakery for making pumpernickel. The Gauls reaped their wheat and then threshed it out by means of oxen and horses, but they also cut off the ears and then reaped the straw. To gather in the panic and millet, they held the stalks by means of a kind of comb, and then cut off the heads with shears. To prevent its being stolen, the corn was hidden in underground storehouses, and often in natural caves, which were afterwards walled up. They used mealing stones, as before described, in order to crush and roughly grind their grain, which was made into an unleavened cake, dry and thin, which was not cut but was broken when served. They also had a kind of bread called plate bread, which they ate soaked with sauce or meat gravy. The Gauls made beer from barley and used it instead of water to mix their dough with. Thus, unconsciously, they discovered the secret of leavened bread, and by, noticing that the beer, if let alone, frothed, and that when used for bread making in this state, the bread was lighter, they let off using the beer and only employed the yeast. Barley they called grue, which in Latin became grudum. Gruellum was husked barley, which the Gauls ate in soup and with boiled meat. This is the origin of the French word gruau, groats, which is equally applied to husked oats. Rye was used in the northern part of Gaul, and from the time of Strabo, millet was in use among the Gauls as well as panic, but especially in Aquitaine. They also certainly knew of buckwheat, which had been cultivated from time immemorial in Africa, for it has been found in several Celtic remains in the Camp de Chalons. The Romans brought millstones with them and introduced the water wheel, which saved them the exertion of personally grinding their corn. And with the arrival of the Franks came Christianity, and they were taught the prayer, Our Father, which art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. In the 12th and 13th centuries in France, noblemen, the middle class, and shopkeepers did not eat much white bread, and their best was equal to the household bread of today, whilst whitey brown, brown, and bran breads were to be found on their tables. The common folk fed on bread made of barley, rye, maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye, brown bread, black bread, and enormous pasties, of which the thick crust was composed of rye, bran, and flour mixed together. Maize was introduced into France from America in 1560. Champier speaks of it as a plant recently imported, and says, Some poor people, in default of corn, have made bread of it, especially in the Beaujolais, but it is less fitted for men than for animals, which fatten quickly upon it, and especially for pigeons who love it so much. Vermicelli, macaroni, lasagnas or ribboned vermicelli, and other Italian pastas were brought into France during the wars of Charles VIII, and had no other rivals than rice. At this time, in making bread, the yeast of beer was partially abandoned, and other ferments were made use of. The Flemings boiled wheat, and after having skimmed off the froth, used it as a leaven, which gave them a bread much lighter than hitherto, or, according to Champier and Liébeault, who wrote in 1589, they employed vinegar, wine, and rennet. And from their writings we find that the farmers were their own millers and bakers. It would be useless for the laborer to take so much pains with his land if he only derived a profit from the sale of the grain which he has harvested, if he could not himself make cakes, flamèche or flaky pastry, flans, cakes made with flour, eggs, milk, and butter, fritters, and 1,000 other dainties, which he can make with a flour from his own corn, and it would be very unbecoming in him were he to borrow them from his neighbors, or buy them of the bakers or pastry cooks. The farmer's duty is to choose his corn, have it ground, and to keep the flour in the granary, whence he will soon take it in order to make bread. The handling of the flour and kneading the dough is entirely the care of the wife, who ought to give all her best energies to it, for of all food, bread is the best. One gets tired of the most delicate meats, but never of bread. From this time till the present, there is no great story to tell of bread in France. It has progressed in quality, as in every other country, until French bread is famous throughout the civilized world. But this is mainly in the towns. Black bread is still in use in some of the rural parts of France, and one can imagine the relish with which the peasant tastes once more the bread of his youth, after having been deprived of it for some time. In Paris at one time, the monks controlled the bakery business. They had the monopoly of the public ovens, where housewives brought the dough to be baked, just as nowadays they take a shoulder of mutton and potatoes. But no baking was allowed on Sundays and fête days. France thus observed Sunday as a whole holiday, and the oven tax went towards the support and burial of the poor. Up to 1789, the bakers were compelled to sell nearly all their bread at stalls in the public markets, and 900 master bakers monopolized the privilege, for it was only in 1863 that the trade became free and thrown open to all. Previous to that, in order to qualify for a master baker, it was necessary to graduate 5 years as an apprentice and 4 more as a journeyman. Also, the sale of fancy bread was obliged to be carried on in an underhand way, and it was delivered in secret, being subject to a tax, and the baker not being able to make it of exact weight without prejudice on account of its great extent of crust. American flour is celebrated all over the world, and is more extensively used in England, especially the finest sorts for pastry. But of course the demand for it in the immense continent itself is something enormous. Take one instance, Philadelphia, which is celebrated for its good bread. Over 1 million barrels are sold in that city annually for home consumption, and 2/3 of this is made into bread. The 1,300 bakers in Philadelphia use 600,000 barrels, a barrel of good flour making from 270 to 280 5-cent loaves, and the best flour is the cheapest to use. As a rule, the bakers use choice brands and mix 4 grades to get the proper alloy, so to speak, 2 Minnesota Springs and 2 Indiana Winters. Some bakers, especially those who make the best breads, use only 1 grade of spring wheat and 2 of winter. In the olden time, yeast was made of malt, potatoes, and hops, and it is still largely used, but the bakers of fancy breads use a patent yellow compressed yeast. There are 7 large steam bread bakeries in Philadelphia, giving employment to 300 or 400 hands. One large establishment manufactures the different varieties of Vienna bread exclusively. It is made of the best flour, and milk instead of water is used to mix the dough. The baking is done in airtight ovens, and the steam generated in baking settles back on the bread instead of escaping. This makes the outer crust thin and tender, and gives the bread a particularly rich taste and pleasant aroma. With the addition of maize and buckwheat, the Americans use the same cereals for making bread as we do, but of course, as is the case with every nation, there are specialties which do not travel abroad. Graham bread is our wholemeal bread, and should be made with the unbolted meal of wheat, and not only that, but the wheat of which it is made should be good plump grain. Otherwise there would be a disproportionate quantity of bran. Then there is Boston brown bread, for which the following is the formula: 1 quart Indian corn meal, 1 quart Graham, 1 quart rye flour, 1 quart white flour, 1 quart boiling water, 1 pint yeast, 1 small cup of molasses, 2 teaspoons of salt, ½ cup of burnt sugar coloring. For rye and Indian corn bread, it is only necessary to change the above recipe by leaving out the Graham and white flour, and doubling the proportions of Indian corn meal and rye in their place. Of rolls, there are very many varieties besides the ordinary French rolls. Many hotels have their specialty in this class of bread, and consequently we have Parker, Tremont, Revere, Brunswick, Clarendon, St. James, Windsor, etc. rolls, besides which there are twist and sandwich rolls. Chapter 7. Early English Bread. When the culture of grain in Britain really commenced, we cannot possibly tell, but we know that the Phoenicians traded with this island in very early times for tin. All that we really know is from the fragments of writing left by Pytheas, who may, in one sense, be said to have been the discoverer of Britain. About 340 BC, the Greek colony which the Greeks had planted at Massilia or Marseille wished to extend their trade, and whether at their expense or his own, Pytheas, a learned man, a geographer and astronomer, set sail for parts unknown in the Western Ocean. Diodorus Siculus, who lived just before the Christian era, must have taken his account of the Britons from Pytheas. In Book 5, Chapter 2, he says, "They dwell in mean cottages, covered for the most part with reeds and sticks. In reaping their corn, they cut the ears from off the stalk and house them in repositories underground. Thence they take and pluck out the grains of as many of the oldest of them as may serve them for the day, and after they have bruised the corn, make it into bread." It is said also that about this time the Britons exported corn to Gaul and also up the Rhine. On Caesar's arrival, he found them an agricultural people with abundance of wheat and barley, and during the time of the Roman occupation they made great advances in agriculture. After their departure, a hide of land was 180 acres if it was cultivated on the Roman 3-field system, or 160 if on the English plan of 2-field course. In the former, one portion was sown with winter wheat, a second with spring wheat, whilst the third lay fallow. The English way was to divide the hide, and in each half to sow alternately spring and winter wheat, and the chief crops raised were rye, oats, barley, wheat, beans, and peas. In social rank, the yeoman or jennet, the tenant farmer, ranked next after the thane and the priest, whilst even the baker was an important member of a thane's household, the bread being made in round flat cakes from wholemeal, for there is no mention of bolting it, ground in a hand-mill or quern. Such were doubtless the storied cakes which Alfred watched for the Nethard's wife. The peasant's bread was principally made of rye, oats, and beans, the wheat being used by the gentry only, ordinary bread being made of barley. And connected with the latter are derived our names of Lord and Lady, the first from Lafford, originator of bread, or bread-ward, the latter from Lafthige, bread-maid, or bread-maker. So too we owe our wedding cake to the great loaf made by the bride to show her inauguration into housewifery, which was partaken of by the wedding guests. The peasant baked his bread on iron plates or in rude ovens, and ground his coarse meal in hand mills, but in later times water was made the principal motive power for grinding corn, and about 5,000 mills are mentioned in the Doomsday Book, but they are not particularized as to what power they were worked by. As a trade, the bakers of London rank from a very early date. They formed a brotherhood or guild in the reign of Henry II, about 1155. Stowe says of them, "The company of white bakers are of great antiquity, as appeareth by their records, and divers other things of antiquity extant in their common hall. They were a company of this city in the first year of Edward II, and had a new charter granted unto them in the first year of Henry VII, the which charter was confirmed unto them by Henry VIII, Edward VI, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and King James I. Their arms were anciently born. The crest and supporters were granted to them by Robert Cook Clarenceau, the letters patent bearing date November 8th, 1590, the 32nd year of Elizabeth. The cloud on the chief through which the hand holding the scales cometh hath a glory, omitted in the edition printed 1633, and on each side of the hand are two anchors, here also omitted, as by the Visitation Book, Anno 1634, appears. Stowe describes the company of the Brown Bakers as a society of long standing and continuance, prevailed to have their incorporating granted the 9th day of June, in the 19th year of the reign of our sovereign lord, King James I. The arms of both White and Brown Bakers are copied from Harleian manuscript 1464, 57e, A.D. 1634. The arms of these and other companies being copied from the Herald's Visitation of that year by the Reverend Price, arms painter. Heraldrically described, the arms of the White Bakers are gules, 3 garbs or, a chief berry wavy of 4, argent and azure, an arm issuing from clouds radiating of the 2nd, the hand holding a pair of scales depending between the upper garbs, also of the 2nd. Crest, 2 arms embowed issuing out of clouds, proper, holding in the hands a chaplet of wheat or. Supporters, 2 stags, proper, attired or, each gorged with a chaplet of wheat of the last. The arms of the Brown Bakers closely resemble those of their white brethren, but are not so dignified, as lacking supporters and motto. Vert, a chevron quarterly, or and gules, charged with a pair of balances azure, holden by a hand out of a cloud, proper, between 3 garbs of beans, rye, and wheat, or, on a chief berry of 5, wavy, argent, and azure, an anchor couchant, or. Crest, an arm quarterly of the 2nd, the hand holding a bean sheaf, proper. W. Carew Hazlitt, in his Livery Companies of the City of London, 1892, says, in the Elizabeth, as in the Henry VIII Charter, the White Bakers had taken the initiative in drawing the makers of brown bread, whose business was far more limited and unimportant, into union with them on unequal terms, and the latter body dissented and renounced. Whereupon the Queen was advised by the Lords of the Council to recall her patent. This proceeding seems for a time to have caused the matter to drop, but on June 6, 1622, the Brown Bakers succeeded in securing separate incorporation with a common seal, a master, 3 wardens, and 16 assistants, as well as all other usual rights and powers. We hear nothing further of the matter till 1629, when the 2 bodies were still separate, the White Bakers being assessed for a levy by the city in that year at £25 16 shillings, the other at £4 6 shillings, a proof of the relative weight and resources of the disputants, which is confirmed by the proportions contributed by each to the Ulster scheme a few years prior. namely 480 pounds and 90 pounds. In 1654, the Brown bakers had apparently relinquished their independent quarters at Founders Hall, Lothbury, as if a union had been arranged, and in the second year of James II's reign, the charter was received with the usual restrictions in regard to the oaths of allegiance and supremacy and conformity to the Church of England, but otherwise in such a form as to lead to the belief that it comprehended both sections of the trade. The Bakers' Company ranks very high after the 12 great city companies on account of its great antiquity. Its hall in Stowe's time was in Hart Lane or Harp Lane, which likewise runneth from Tower Street into Thames Street. In this Hart Lane is the Bakers' Hall, sometime the dwelling house of John Chichley, Chamberlain of London, and in Harp Lane it still is. According to Whitaker's Almanac for 1904, its livery numbers 152, and its total income is only £1,900. And that seems as good a place as any to end this evening's reading from the History of Bread. When next we pick this one up, we'll hear a long list of bread crimes committed by English bakers, so that's something to look forward to. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. I always love hearing your suggestions. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.